Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I find this hearing incredibly important. I am concerned, and it will take the Congress, particularly the Senate, to help lead on these issues with Russia. Because, there are times that we have led when administrations have not sought to be engaged or to be engaged in the way that we collectively have thought is necessary. Iran is a great example of that. And my sense and my concern with this administration on Russia is profound. I only hear you can impugn our allies of long standing, but you treat with a soft velvet glove one of the most significant strategic challenges we have with Russia. You can actually say that there is a moral equivalency, that we have killers here, and that the United States, do you think the United States is so good when you are speaking vis-a-vis Russia, who poisons its opposition, kills its opposition, invades another country, violates the international norm, goes ahead and indiscriminately bombs in Aleppo civilians, and somehow you can even fashion a statement that there is some degree of equivalency? It's shocking, shocking. And then to have a cyber attack against the United States to pursue the very fundamental elements of democracy in the world's greatest democracy, and therefore send a message globally and not have a sense of urgency about an investigation into such, it's shocking to me. If this was a different time, I would hear a different chorus of voices. So I really do hope, and I'm proud to see that some of our colleagues are moving in that direction, whether it be the legislation that Senator Cardin spoke to have a congressional review as to whether sanctions should be relieved on Russia if, in fact, they have not met their obligations under international norms, or to further pursue sanctions, as I understand from listening in my office in between meetings, some of the commentary and testimony has been taken here. I really am concerned. And so I think this is incredibly important for us to continue to take a role. And I personally have never necessarily waited for an administration to give me the green light, because, at the end of the day, it is what we collectively think is important. And sometimes the Senate leads in these regards, and we get others to realize it's the right policy. Let me ask you some specific questions. General Breedlove, I know you had a conversation with Senator Portman. I just want to get these two statements on the record. We all aspire for NATO to meet its obligations 2% across the board, without equivocation. But as we seek to make that happen, the absence of any given country not having 2% should never undermine the very essence of the importance of NATO to us. Is that a fair statement?
Senator, if I could answer that question, but finish what I was going to say here.
I've got a minute and 30 seconds, so you give me, I'll give you 20 seconds.
2% is incredibly important.
Yep.
Of that 2%, as important to me is the 20% investment in recapitalization of equipment. If all 2% are spent on just personnel, it's not that relevant to me.
But it's important to us as a force multiplier and the hosting of bases, among other things, in our own national interest and security. Is that not a fair statement?
That is correct.
And what I would also... Let me ask you this. Would it be wrong, and I ask you this to both of you, would it be wrong to remove sanctions on Russia unless Russia ultimately resolves what it has done in invading Crimea and Ukraine and restores its obligations under the international order? Would it not be fair to say that that would send the wrong message globally?
Absolutely. It would be wrong to trade sanctions for anything outside of Russia's actions in Ukraine. Those sanctions are there for a reason. They are not arbitrary, and they should only be lifted when we see a change in Russian policy inside Ukraine.
Senator Breedlove? General Breedlove?
I subscribe.
Maybe you want to run for the Senate. It might be a bad thing. So,
I'm not qualified for that, sir. I would just say that a conditionality, as you've described it, is absolutely key to me.
I have other questions, but I'll wait if we get another round. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the courtesy. Appreciate it. General Breedlove, a day or two ago we met with several of the Baltic ambassadors to the United States as well as Poland. And in the course of that conversation on many things, one thing that struck me is they say that there is an exercise, a Russian exercise coming up of 100,000 Russian troops in Belarus. Now, we do conduct exercises, I get that, but 100,000 Russian troops in Belarus, so much so that I understand Belarus notified, I believe it's NATO, because of the size. What is an appropriate, if you were advising President Trump, what is an appropriate action, response, set of circumstances to make sure that a training exercise doesn't end up as anything more than a training exercise?
So, Senator, thank you. That's Zapad 17, no. Zapad 13, and Zapad means west in Russian. So what this is pointed at is very clear. Zapad 17 is a bit alarming because Zapad 13 was, who do you listen to, 10 to 20,000 troops? Sir, I've heard 200,000. What I do know is that the Russians have ordered 83 times, not 83, but 83 times the rail cars that they ordered for Zapad 13. And so the size of this exercise will be demonstratively bigger than Zapad 13. Nations have a right to exercise. Nations do not have a right, I think, to exercise irresponsibly on other borders and in configurations that represent offensive capability. Part of the problem I saw as a SACUR in these SNAP exercises that we see. In NATO, our exercises are scheduled, published, duration, and objective is all published. The SNAP exercises we see in Russia, I think, are a tool that actually we may have used in the past of conditioning an enemy so that they don't really see what's happening. And we saw a lot of that conditioning going on in the Western and Southern Military District before they went into Crimea and before they went into the Donbass. And so I think the problem with this exercise is size and scope directly on the border, a name that orients it west, and the fact that the unpredictability of it makes it very alarming. How do we respond? NATO has debated, do we tit for tat? Do we remain calm? Do we do some portion of increasing alert and others? I am not a fan of tit for tat. I think we should drive our exercise based on what we need to learn and do. But I would be a supporter of what I would call responsible increases in alert and posture should the unthinkable happen.
Yeah. I don't know what's unthinkable anymore after Crimea and Ukraine, and that's why I worry about this exercise and its magnitude. Maybe a large delegation of members of the Senate in that part of the region of the world at that time might be a good thing, too. Let me ask you both, this is the final question, and it piggybacks a little bit on the question of Senator Rubio, or the statement he was praising. You know, I found a Time magazine article from December, which I also cited during Secretary Tillerson's confirmation hearing, to be rather illuminating, at least from the perspective of what it was saying. And I'd like to get both of your takes on it, about Russia's intentions with the new administration. And I'm going to quote from the article. It says, what the Russians want from Tillerson, however, is bigger than sanctions relief. They want to see a whole new approach to American diplomacy, one that stops putting principles ahead of profits, focuses instead on getting the best political bargain available, and treats Russia as an equal on the global stage. For the next 4 years, we can forget about America as the bearer of values, said Vladimir Milov, a former Russian energy minister who went on to join the opposition. America is going to play the deal game under Trump. And for Putin, that's a very comfortable environment, he told a radio show in Moscow. It's an environment, and this is where I worry, it's an environment where statesmen sit before a map of the world and haggle over the pieces available to them, much like weighing the oil fields of Texas against Russia's reserves in the Arctic. Through the canny eyes of a political deal-maker, many of Washington's oldest commitments in Europe and the Middle East could come to be seen in much the same way, as a stack of bargaining chips to be traded rather than principles to be upheld. What do you think? Do you think that that's an insightful view of what Russia wants, expects, hopes for? And should we be looking at the world? There's one thing to be politique real. The other thing is and being pragmatic. The other thing is, negotiating away the very essence of our principles and negotiating other countries' territories. If you're not at the table, that's not a particularly good deal for you. Can you give me insights as to your perspectives on that?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I agree with the piece. I think he has multiple goals, Putin, in undermining the democratic institutions that served as the bedrock of the transatlantic relationship for 70 years. He would love nothing more than to call into question our commitment to each other, the values that we share, we work to protect and promote, which is his biggest worry. His biggest fear has always been that the West would somehow fuel some sort of color revolution inside Russia. And he called out Secretary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time, for doing exactly that, for planting seeds of the protests that erupted after he was elected again in 2012. And so he's been very anxious about everything that the West stands for. And so, yes, he wants to undermine our values, our institutions, our unity and resolve. And I think we have to work now and quickly to ensure that he doesn't do that.
Senator, if I could, not to be contrary to the piece or any others, I would just offer that, in my mind, Russia's intentions haven't changed. It doesn't matter which, from several administrations to now. Their intentions really haven't changed. Maybe the tools might change based on the approach of the leadership in the West. But to question the West and certainly question the U.S. leadership of the West, to establish Russia as a world power and certainly as the director of operations in their region, all these things I don't think have changed. Just the tools might have changed.